Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session on protecting the public core of the internet. My name is Alexander Klimburg from the Hague Center of Strategic Studies. I'm the director of the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace. I'm joined by a number of members of the Global Commission today: Latha, Reddy, Wolfgang Kleinwächter, Uri Rosenthal, and Anriette Esterhuysen. And they will present the work of the Commission on the public core with the help of a trusted PowerPoint, which I hope will not fail us. After that, we will invite two external commentators not affiliated with the GCSC, Cristine Hoepers and Fiona Alexander, to share some thoughts. After which I hope we can all enter into a group discussion. All of this, I would like to point out, is on the record. Now, before we turn to our commissioners, it might be helpful to quickly brief you on what is the GCSC. Now, we are a private initiative based around our 28 non-state commissioners and chairs, who you can see listed here. Please move forward 2 slides. And who together hail from 17 countries and from very different parts of the wider cybersecurity ecosystem. We have activists and scholars, as well as former ministers and senior government security officials. We took our mandate from the 2015 meeting of the GCSC, of the Global Conference on Cyberspace that was held in The Hague, as well as the 2015 report of the UN Group of Governmental Experts, where it was noted that the strongly government-oriented discussions on what is sometimes called international cybersecurity issues needed some way and some method to get non-state input. So we therefore describe ourselves as a truly multi-stakeholder initiative, and our board is around 50% state and 50% non-state actors. In total, we have received support from about 9 governmental organizations and about 7 private sector and civil society initiatives. Now, the objective of the Commission has been to develop norms and policy initiatives that help advance cyberstability, which means that we are oriented to influencing the primarily state-oriented discussions on war and peace that occur, for instance, within the UN First Committee. Now, the accumulation of our deliberations is our report, Advancing Cyberstability. And with that, I would like to turn to our first speaker, Latha Reddy. Ambassador Reddy is the co-chair of the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace. She's a former Deputy National Security Advisor of India, where she was the first such official to be responsible for international cybersecurity. She also served on a predecessor initiative of the GCSC, namely the Global Commission on Internet Governance, sometimes known as the BILT Commission. And together with her co-chair, Michael Chertoff, she launched the full report of the GCSC at the Paris Peace Forum in November of last year. And she's therefore probably the best person to tell us a little bit of what that report looked like. Latha, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. I just wanted to say that as far as I'm concerned, the launching of the report at the Paris Peace Forum last year in November was the culmination of 3 years of very hard work, facilitated, of course, by Alex and his team as the GCSC Secretariat. And what we did produce, and which has, I believe, resonated with the international cyber community, has been a very clearly laid out idea of what we hope to achieve. We also defined, as you will see from the slide, a cyberstability framework. And while we identified 7 core areas, we decided to really concentrate on 3 of them. The 3 being multi-stakeholder engagement, cyber secure stability principles, and the development and implementation of voluntary norms. I believe the stability framework will advance our idea of what we mean by cyber stability. We will also, perhaps in future engagements, look at the other remaining categories, which, as you see, are adherence to international law, confidence building measures, capacity building, open promulgation, and widespread use of technical standards. I'd now like to move on to the GCSC principles that we developed. There are 4 principles. Essentially, responsibility. Everyone is responsible for ensuring the stability of cyberspace. Restraint, by which we mean no state or non-state actor should take actions that impair the stability of cyberspace. The requirement to act, state and non-state actors should take reasonable and appropriate steps to ensure the stability of cyberspace. And finally, and perhaps most important, respect for human rights. Efforts to ensure the stability of cyberspace must respect human rights and the rule of law. Building on these principles, the Commission has crafted 8 norms. And the first norm is the one that we will be discussing further in detail, where my fellow panelists will go more into detail on how we formulated this and what we see as the possible implementation of this norm. The 8 norms, speaking very briefly, and as you see on the screen, are firstly to protect the public core of the internet. The second is the norm to avoid tampering. The third is for the norm for states to create a vulnerable equity process. The fourth is the norm against commandeering of ICT devices into botnets. The fifth is the norm to reduce and mitigate significant vulnerabilities. The sixth is the norm on basic cyber hygiene. The seventh is the norm against offensive cyber operations. And the eighth is the norm to protect the electoral infrastructure. All of these have received excellent support. And I would say that 2 or 3 of them in particular have really received not just support, but have been endorsed by various bodies. Alex, I don't know whether you would like me to add anything else at this point, or should we move on to the actual discussion?
Well, thank you, Latha. I think that was a great introduction. We're obviously going to circle back to a lot of the points that you mentioned. I think, as you pointed out, the report is a rather comprehensive document, and we've addressed a lot more than just the public core alone. I think it's also rather interesting, of course, to note that the cyberstability framework itself, which you showed, turned out to be a rather popular talking point in some of the UN working groups, which we didn't expect at the time. But indeed, our focus today is on the public core. And with that, I would like to turn to our next speaker. Wolfgang Kleinwächter is a professor emeritus at the University of Aarhus and probably one of the most prominent scholars working on internet governance. He's been engaged in the subject since the early 1990s, before it really even existed. So he's not only an observer, having served on the ICANN board of directors besides other ICANN bodies, and also acting as a special ambassador to the Net Mondial initiative. He is also a hands-on member of the internet governance community. From that perspective, he has developed a unique view on why the public core norm is needed, and therefore over to you, Wolfgang.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Okay, fine. You know, as Alex has said, the norm to protect the public core is one of the key outcomes of the discussions. You know, this is rooted in the norm which was established by the GTE in 2015 to declare that attacks against critical infrastructures should not be done by governments. And what we have seen in the recent months is that the functioning of the internet in a time as we have now with the pandemic, you know, could undermine fundamentally the well-being of the whole society. So, and the bad thing is what we have seen in the recent months and years is that a growing number of attacks against this, what we call the public core of the internet. That is, means the domain name system, the routing system, and so there has been attacks against what we call DNS hijacking or DNS espionage. There has been some cases like the so-called sea turtle case from 2019, where a root server was attacked. So it's still unclear who is behind all these attacks. But, you know, our conclusion from the, let's say, growing threat which comes along with attacks against the the core of the internet, the technical core, was that this should be a special norm. So because the public core, the functioning of the public core is in the interest of whole community, regardless of the different economic or political interests different countries or stakeholders have. I think everybody should be interested that the core of the internet is functioning. So in the time where we discussed this norm, we compared it also a little bit, with other traditions of the in international law, where we have, let's say, crimes, international crimes, and then crimes against humanity, which is a special category and treated internationally in a different way. And our more or less reference was that while there are international crimes or violation of international laws, attack against the public core is a very special case, and it could be treated like a crime against humanity, because everybody is now so dependent on this. With all this, what we have experienced in the last 6 months after the report was presented has strengthened our call to have stronger measures to protect the public core. Homeschooling, home office, learning and shopping. All this is now in a world where we have to live with distance and no traveling. So it becomes so important that if the public core doesn't function, so this has tremendous negative implications for the whole global economy and for the also for the well-being of billions of internet users. And that's why, we are very happy to see that our proposal to single out this norm as a special norm on the basis of the norm to protect critical infrastructure in cyberspace is taken now by many other organizations as a guideline or a bridge into future discussions. And I was in particular pleased to see in the roadmap of the UN Secretary General that they have incorporated this as an element in the strategy of the United Nations. And in one chapter of the roadmap, you have also a very special support for the understanding of public in the internet, protection the public good. If you link the concept of public good with the concept of protecting the public core, then you see that this norm has a lot of potential for further discussion. Just 2 days ago, the German government and the government of the UAE presented its opinion paper, which will guide the UN community into the discussion of the coming months and years on the 75th General Assembly of the United Nations, and also in this opinion paper. So you have references to these elements. And I think, so we are in the middle of a discussion, but the norm of the protection of the public core is a good starting point for future discussion. Back to you, Alex. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Wolfgang. And thank you for also connecting it to the UN processes. We will get back to the discussion, I think, a little bit later. But I think it's also important to note that the definition of the public core that we showed, some aspects such as the packet routing and forwarding and naming and numbering systems, I think were fairly clearly defined and have been relatively widely accepted, while other aspects such as, for instance, physical transmission media, i.e. cables, are not yet so clearly defined. So this is partially still an open definition that we're all working on together, and there are a lot of different voices out there, which is one reason why it's so important to have this discussion here at RightsCon. Now, a loud voice in this community are, of course, that of states, and our next speaker can help explain their perspective. Uri Rosenthal is a former foreign minister of the Netherlands, and he was the first foreign minister of that country to strongly engage on international cybersecurity affairs. For instance, while he was in office, he was instrumental in the launch of the Freedom Online Coalition. After leaving office, he returned to his original job as a university professor, but he continued to serve with the Dutch government, for instance, as their special representative for the Global Conference on Cyberspace, which was hosted in The Hague in 2015, which was also important for the mandate of our own initiative. As such, he can provide a special insight into what governments have said about the public core norm. So over to you, Uri.
You can hear me?
Yes, we hear you fine.
Yeah. Okay, there we go. Thank you, Alex. Let me say, I'm talking about the adoption of the public core norm, and let me say that we have really made a lot of progress in terms of implementing this norm. And let me pick up, just for the sake of briefness, let me just pick up a couple of things. First, let me say that it is important to notice that, and Latha Reddy was already mentioning it, that the Paris call for trust and security in cyberspace explicitly refers to the Commission's flagship norm on protecting the public core of the internet. Let me say, by the way, that to call it the flagship norm of this of our global commission is very, very nice to hear, because it has always been my pet child, this public core norm. Through the Paris call, the several norms have already gained the backing of over 1,000 like-minded states, companies, and civil society organizations. And in line with this, the so-called Paris Call Community of Interest has also been established by the Hague Center for Strategic Studies to further refine the concept of public core, already mentioned by Alex. And it also explores the options for implementing and monitoring the principle, as well as related norms. And let me say that interested parties, Alex knows all about it, are invited to reach out to the Hague Center for this matter. Now, this having been said, of course, we are always keen on seeing some symbolic but also content-oriented messages on the part of political leaders and important people in the world. And for that matter, it is, of course, of great importance that at the Internet Governance Forum, for instance, Chancellor Angela Merkel and also the father of the Internet, Vint Cerf, made a clear reference to the need to protect the public core of the Internet. And history shows that it is not always easy to attain a supported policy against abuse. And when political leaders are indeed focusing on it, it is of the greatest possible importance. Let me pick up, again, for the sake of briefness, two other important messages on the adoption of the public norm. Also, thanks to our Commissioner Marietje Schake's lobbying, the EU actually has brought the public norm explicitly into its Cybersecurity Act, which extends, by the way, the mandate of ENISA to include the protection of the public core of the Internet. The fact that we have this public norm indeed inserted into the Cybersecurity Act of the EU is of great importance. And then last but not least, in this respect, the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on digital cooperation indeed also has put a priority on so-called digital public goods, already mentioned by Wolfgang Kleinwächter. And more recently, the UN Open-Ended Working Group, in its draft report, included the work of the Global Commission, and most notably the norm to protect the public core of the Internet. And by the way, also a second norm we have highly stressed, the electoral infrastructure norm. Now, adding to this, on slide 13, you see the world in several colors. Nearly 80 states support the public norm via the Paris Call. They are marked in blue. Then we have the green countries from the 44 states that submitted responses to the UN Open-Ended Working Group pre-draft report. 12 expressed support for the public norm, core norm. They are mentioned in green. Then we have 3 countries that were neutral or had definitional questions, not solved yet. They are marked in yellow. And last but not last, the others that submitted a response to the Open-Ended Working Group are marked in gray. Now, the countries that support the norm both through the Paris Call and the Open-Ended Working Group are marked in green and blue stripes. The countries supportive of the norm through the Paris Call but neutral, etc., are marked in blue and yellow stripes. Last but not least, regional organizations, it has already been mentioned, like the EU, also expressed their support for the norm, and the EU indeed has brought it into its formal legislation. May I take the opportunity to say that what I, of course, am striving for is that also the so-called Freedom Online Coalition of 35 countries, which are up to an open and free and secure internet, would also adopt the public core norm as one of its assets. Thank you, Alex.
Well, thank you, Uri. Thank you also for showing how really wide some government support has developed over the last couple of years, even though it's far from certain that the public core norm will actually enter the final draft of the open-ended working group, if that is ever agreed upon. There is clearly widespread and growing support from states for the general principle. To come back to what Wolfgang said previously, it could be also seen as an expansion of existing norms besides being its own norm. But we're not only interested in state support, and our next speaker can also help illustrate how the public core is being received in practice. Anriette Esterhuysen was the South African Executive Director of the Association for Progressive Communications and continues to be involved in that organization as a consultant. She was inducted into the Internet Hall of Fame in 2014 and has participated in a number of UN working groups related to internet governance. And most recently, she was appointed chair of the multi-stakeholder advisory group of the Internet Governance Forum. She's therefore a seasoned observer of the scene and can tell us a little bit of where the public core currently is heading. Over to you, Anriette.
Thanks, Alex, and greetings to everyone at RightsCon and everyone else on the panel. I think this norm really goes to the heart of the challenge of ensuring some form of certainty of multi-stakeholder internet governance. So it doesn't just help us achieve cyberstability in the context of cyber insecurity, as has been discussed previously. I think it helps us get closer to an approach to internet governance that, number one, recognizes that the internet is multi-stakeholder, that it's an entity that is created, shaped, managed, developed by entities from the public sector, from the private sector, from the technical community and civil society, but at the same time that it has this character of a global public good or a digital public good. And I think what this core does is that this norm does. Firstly, it's narrow. The public core is defined in quite a narrow way. It relates to the transmission infrastructure and the core protocols that enables an interoperable universal internet. And it addresses that. And it says that this is public, that it should be protected as such. And I think we can extrapolate from that it should be governed as such. Therefore, I think it's a helpful concept that addresses so many current internet governance challenges, such as I think today the big internet companies are addressing US Congress. At the heart of that debate is what part of the internet can we assert as and govern as being public without contradicting the notion that it is a multi-stakeholder entity and that it should be governed in a multi-stakeholder way. And I think Wolfgang has already said that the roadmap on digital cooperation developed by the UN Secretary General towards increasing cooperative digital governance that asserts also the need that we need to look at digital public goods. And I think this norm helps us achieve that. I'd like to see this norm discussed beyond just the cybersecurity sector. I think it's a norm that can be helpful to the internet policy and governance community more broadly as a core principle. And it doesn't have to be a hard norm. It can be a voluntary norm. We have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a non-binding agreement, but which is a very powerful normative instrument. And I believe this norm in its current form, but possibly also in forms that it can be developed into, can play a similar role in creating some kind of true north for global multi-stakeholder, public, interested-oriented internet governance.
Well, thank you, Anriette. That's indeed a unique perspective on how the public core has contributed to the multi-stakeholder discussion as well. And I also say that I think it's been quite apparent that the Internet Governance Forum community has seen very often the public core as also an instrument to effectively bring the multi-stakeholder discussion into international security. And I really hope that also continues in the future development of the IGF, which we probably will talk about a little bit in a while. Now, just before we go to a general discussion, I would like to give our two external commentators the opportunity to share their view on the public core, or indeed our work in general. We can go to gallery mode now. So Cristine is general manager of the Brazilian National CERT, where she's been working on incident management since 1999. Amongst other things, she served as a steering committee and board member of the Global Incident Response Forum FIRST. And over the last few years, FIRST has taken on a much more prominent role in international security discussions, becoming sometimes the voice of the technical community in the rather governmental focused security discussions that take place, for instance, in the open-ended working group. So we're very interested in what Cristine has to say, and thank you for joining and sharing your thoughts. Well, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for the kind words, and hi to everyone in RightsCon. And I think FIRST was very involved starting in 2013 and 14, when the IGF started to talk about best practices for CERTs and instant response. And at that time, we were in a political climate that some people wanted to move CERTs as something more aggressive, as part of cyber war or something else. So, and that was always very unproductive, because CERTs, we need to help people, and we need to help people to avoid cybercrime. We need to help people to avoid other technical problems. And the situation just started to get worse when we start to have governments also affecting the security of the internet. And I think one of the big problems also is the unintended consequences of all this situation that's happening. And I would like just to, for this audience, that I think it's an audience that's very keen to privacy and very keen to protecting rights of citizens. One of the things that is very complicated is not only what happens when someone breaks a norm, like this important norm of protecting the cybercore, but the unintended consequence that go. For example, just last week, we had an organization that uncovered that 20 million people that used VPNs worldwide had all their data exposed for cyber criminals, for other governments. And that happened just because the service was not good, and the service was poorly configured, and all the database was available on the internet. And this is a case where you have citizens being pushed for services, and then you create a market for a service that's a VPN, for example. But if that service is not well implemented, the citizens would be much better if they were just using regular HTTPS or regular services, but they are afraid of using the internet now because they are not sure if someone is actually doing something with their cryptographic algorithms. We also have in the Netherlands the DigiNotar case several years ago. I think that's almost 10 years ago, when one government compromised the root certificate authority of the Netherlands, and that affected another country. And people started to get worried about this, and then they are pushed to use even weaker services, because now they are they could be affected by governments with surveillance, but they could also be affected by the whole criminal organizations and cybercrime. So I think it gets everyone in a worse scenario. And I think this is really complicated because we see, especially here in Brazil, more and more talks about weakening cryptographic algorithms. And I think it was very wise that the public core norm says that cryptography mechanisms, security and identity is very important, because it's not only thinking about the internet as a core, as routing, but also thinking of the internet as core protocols and core security for the citizens. I think this is very important. And from our perspective as incident response teams, it's very complicated if we cannot know if the incident we are dealing with cybercrime? Are we dealing with another country? This is creating distrusts among national certs because we don't know exactly who you are talking to. So there is so much unintended consequences on that happening. And that is really why I think our community started to get more and more involved in best practice. One point that I would like to say that it's very important also in another norm, it's not the public core, but it's very keen to me and to the whole security community, is the norm of cyber hygiene, because it's very difficult to increase security when we have all our computers and IoT and even routers and infrastructure so weak and not very well configured with so many problems, and being part of the tools for the cybercrime and for people that really want to mess with security. So that is a very important norm. And in the chat of the transmission, someone talked that manners from ISOC, the mutual agreed norms for routing, it's very important. And I think this is something we are pushing here. And this is part of cyber hygiene, because you need to have the technical community, the ISPs, they are the ones you need to reinforce the core as well. So I think they are very strong norms, and they should walk hand to hand as well. So these are the comments I have for now. And I'm very glad that these norms came out and that we have a place to point in some north when we are discussing these norms in cyberspace. So thank you very much to all.
Well, thank you very much, Cristine, for joining and for those comments. I would like to invite the panelists to respond, but after we give Fiona Alexander a chance to share her comments, and then also, of course, the floor is open to her as well. I found it particularly interesting that you highlighted that one of the major unintended consequences that we're dealing with is also effectively a lack of trust in the ecosystem overall, meaning that users will default down to more insecure devices or more insecure protocols, which is actually one of the consequences of the definition that we have of both cyberstability and the public core. If you read closely, trust is actually a major component of what we consider to be inimical to cyberstability. And when you talk about inadvertent consequences, as of course Uri and Latha both particularly know, avoiding inadvertent escalation, in other words, accidental war, is a core aspect of what international cybersecurity is about, because as you correctly say, it's very easy to get cyber espionage mixed up with preparations for cyber war. But before we go into that kind of discussion, I would like to go to our final, but certainly not least speaker. So Fiona Alexander. Fiona is currently a distinguished policy strategist and fellow at American University. Previously, she was the principal U.S. official responsible for internet governance matters, running the National Communications Information Administration within the U.S. Department of Commerce. So during her long-running tenure, I think you joined probably around the same time that ICANN was created, as far as I'm aware. You saw a number of more important milestones in development of the internet, and she was recently awarded the Presidential Rank Award for her leadership, moving the domain name system out of governmental control. So Fiona, thanks for joining, and we look forward to your comments.
Hi, thank you very much, Alex, and thanks for the invitation to participate. And yes, I believe when the ICANN process was started, I was an intern at NTIA, so that was basically my whole career, along with Wolfgang and others that were there. So just to sort of give a few observations on sort of the conversation for today, and when the issue of the public core norm was first raised with me a few years ago, there was no concern about the text or the definition or the words or the goal and what was trying to happen. But the concerns that I had was where the core norm was trying to be adopted. And for me, it seemed inherently a little bit inconsistent that we're trying to have a conversation about adoption of a public core norm when all the topics that are covered in the core norm are developed through bottom-up multi-stakeholder processes. Those are the processes that govern those resources, and those are the processes that run them. And so I always have had some concerns about sort of starting the conversation about adopting a core norm about protecting the public core in a closed UN system. So that has always been my concern, and one of the reasons why there may have been a lot of questions from the U.S. at the time about what was going on. So to be clear, I'm a big fan of this public core norm. I think it should be adopted. I just think the first place to have that conversation is actually the Internet Governance Forum, not the UN in and of itself. And in fact, as a result of a conversation with some of the folks on this a couple of years ago, we were actually involved in actually creating a dynamic coalition on DNS issues at the IGF for the purposes of actually considering whether that was the right venue to actually have this conversation. I also personally am a big believer that the current mandate of the IGF is flexible. It allows stakeholders to adopt recommendations as appropriate, I think were the words that we negotiated at the time. And so I would argue that the current construct of the IGF allows for the fulsome conversation of this kind of core norm and endorsement adoption, whatever the appropriate verb makes you comfortable. But again, I would really, encourage that kind of conversation and look for it to happen there. And I think, if these norms are to be accepted and to be acknowledged and to be used, the how you do something is often as important to me as the what you do. And for me, in this particular instance, because of the history of the domain name system and the resources that are captured as part of this core norm, it really is important that the conversation and then the adoption happen in that community where everyone can be involved, not in a conversation that only includes governments and is closed. So I'll leave it with that.
No, thanks very much, Fiona. I think it also helps start the conversation of, for instance, where the IGF is going as a forum and how that might play a role for the public core norm as well as related initiatives. Is there any comments, of course, please, on what Cristine said beforehand or Fiona just said?
Alex, Anriette, I could comment on what Fiona just said. And Fiona, firstly, I think it is important to note that this norm was not developed inside a UN system. It did come from a multi-stakeholder body. I think what has happened with this norm is that we have sought various windows of opportunity. We've responded to platforms where we think we can propagate the norm. And the current UN processes are among those, such as the Open-Ended Working Group. But I agree with you completely that the IGF really is the platform to take this forward. And as a commission, we have been actively taking this norm and other norms to the IGF. I think the challenge with the IGF, and I'm now speaking as in my capacity as IGF MAG chair as well, is that it is a very bottom-up process. And therefore, it can be quite difficult sometimes to insert a strategic opportunity or initiative such as this into the IGF process and structure, because it does have to come from within the IGF structures itself. And I think this points to a way in which the IGF needs to evolve, I think, so that there can be both the bottom-up processes as well as the capacity for the MAG, for example, and maybe Wolfgang can say more about that, to introduce a discussion like this. I think what did happen, though, reflecting on the last 10 years, I think the IGF, in a sense, became principle shy or norm shy as a result of Net Mundial. Net Mundial and the Net Mundial principles, which includes actually a principle on the internet as a global public resource. Net Mundial emerged from the IGF, but Net Mundial, in a sense, stalled because, and that's the challenge with these processes, these multi-stakeholder processes. Where next? Where do they go? And I think the discussion about norms and principles, which really emerged in the IGF, which fed into Net Mundial, which produced a very powerful outcome statement, has not really had an avenue to move into. And I think what we're hoping is that this discussion on digital cooperation and the roadmap, that can again create an opportunity for this conversation about agreed norms and principles for internet governance broadly. I think the challenge is, again, to have it within the multi-stakeholder space, but with sufficient presence in the multilateral space so that you don't have the multilateral initiatives block what comes out of the multi-stakeholder initiative. Because in a way, that's what happened with Net Mundial. Net Mundial was a very powerful output, but because it couldn't successfully interface with the multilateral space, those outputs, in a sense, dissipated. And I think that's what we need to avoid as we take this notion of the public core norm forward.
Thank you, Anriette. You mentioned, of course, the UN Secretary General's roadmap and the term digital public goods. When I was looking at the exact phrasing, I was wondering to what extent it really applied to the public core. I mean, the term self sounds like global public good, but if you look at it, what it says there, it says like there's a closed list: open source software, open data, open AI models, open standards, and open content. I don't know, does that cover infrastructure or assets? Is there room for public? It doesn't.
No, I think, Alex, I have the same reflection. I think that it's a very indirect link. I think that, yes, I think the document, the roadmap for digital cooperation, is really taking it more from a commons, from an open knowledge perspective. It defines digital public goods from that perspective. But I think that is short-sighted. I think infrastructure is part of it. And I think that the roadmap is also sufficiently open, particularly if you look at other aspects, such as the architecture for digital cooperation and the recognition that there's a need for shared principles. So I think there's still within that roadmap, not just based on the digital commons component of it, but more broadly, I think, there's a need for digital cooperation effectively, particularly when we're talking about multi-stakeholder cooperation, does need to be based on shared norms and principles. And I think this norm can be one.
Latha, you have been dealing with international diplomats for a while now. How is your view? Have you heard that the public good concept or similar has been applied to the internet or to the public core? Because sometimes I have the feeling there's mixed signals. The document might be phrased in a way that digital public goods excludes assets and infrastructure. And then I think other senior officials seem to imply that there is a global public good or a digital public good that includes internet. What's your view?
Alex, this is very interesting because I was actually discussing this very point with Fabrizio Hochschild yesterday.
The Undersecretary General in the United Nations.
The Undersecretary General and I think the Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General on Cyber Affairs. And I put this point to him. In fact, I said he had talked about digital public goods. And as Anriette correctly says, the items listed in the roadmap of the UN do specifically mention other areas, but don't include the critical infrastructure, if you like, of the internet. And I put it to him that given our own work on the public core of the internet, we felt that once you accept that the internet is a digital public good, would it not be logical to say that the underpinnings, the technical underpinnings of the internet are not just a digital public good, but also have to be part of critical infrastructure? I put both these points across. And I have to tell you that, the Undersecretary General said categorically that internet is a global public good. It doesn't necessarily follow that every government accepts that internet is a global public good, but this is the view of the UN, that the internet is a global public good. The specific point as to whether we could consider the public core of the internet as a digital public good was not very clearly answered, I must say. But he did also say that digital infrastructure must be a critical infrastructure because it is no longer a luxury item, as it was perceived as when it first came in, as an academic tool, as a luxury item, not something essential to human survival and developmental goals. He said it is now a critical infrastructure. So, he was obviously speaking on record at an event by the Carnegie Endowment. And I was very encouraged by that. While specifically our points that we've raised, the specific issues we've raised were not accepted in toto, there is an understanding that the internet itself is a digital public good and that it should be a critical infrastructure item as well. As far as government attitudes are concerned, I think governments would not have a problem with saying that digital infrastructure is part of critical infrastructure. In fact, I would say that most governments are really quite cognizant of this and would accept that disrupting connectivity in a country would be quite a disaster, particularly at a time like this during the pandemic, when we are very, very dependent on internet and other tools to help us communicate with each other. But I'm not so sure that they would agree on the global public good part of it. They would definitely see it as a national public good. Everybody would. But as a global public good, I imagine most countries would agree, but there will be some who will not agree. That's my opinion.
Thank you, Latha. Thank you. Fiona, sometimes when we have this discussion, we have it within a diplomatic bubble, if you will, UN First Committee arms control bubble, where the term, for instance, public good and public resource is pretty well understood. I had a conversation once with a government representative of the GACS, of Internet Governance Community, not a diplomat, and they complained that the public core notion had the term public in it, and didn't seem to have much association with the term public good or public resource. I still don't know exactly what to say to that person, although, of course, I refer to all the published items out there. But what's your opinion on it? Have you come across government colleagues that are confused by public good and public resource and how to approach those two different issues? Because as Latha just pointed out, some are connected to infrastructure concepts and some are not.
Yeah, absolutely. And this reminds me that words are really important, right? And especially when you're speaking across cultures and then across languages, word choices can have a huge impact and be unintended in terms of, even if you want to get to the same place, a choice of words can actually take you further apart. And I would just kind of point out that if you look at sort of the Net Mundial statement that Anriette referenced, or even the WSIS text, I don't believe anywhere it ever says the internet is a global public good. And that's because a global public good in certain countries would suggest a utility style regulation, which is actually contrary to the multi-stakeholder model. It would also suggest maybe WTO or trade, and Wolfgang's laughing, or trade disciplines apply. And so what you have to figure out is if we're all trying to pull in the same direction with the roadmap, find words that are going to bring all of these communities together. Because if we're going to try to now say that the internet is a global public good, even people that are going to want to go with you in this direction of the roadmap are going to maybe have pause a little bit, because calling something a public good means different things inside different disciplines. And this is where the Internet Governance Forum and the Internet Governance community is very interesting, because you basically have kind of a collision of traditional diplomatic cyber norms people, you have a collision of the bottom-up multi-stakeholder domain name community, and now a collision of the trade community. So I would just encourage people to, usually when I make these kind of statements, I like to have a solution to offer. I don't in this case at this point, because I've just sort of realized it over the course of this conversation. But I think people need to be careful about finding the right words so that everybody that wants to come with you on this journey can come with you. But if we can. But
Fiona, I just wanted to quickly interrupt, because I think normally I think it's the other way around. So the global public good is the one that doesn't require international shared distribution management, and global public resources is the one that requires a central organization for redistribution, right? That's why the EU.
I have the opposite version of that in my head. See, that's part of the problem. Yeah. Exactly.
It can be quite difficult. I wanted to take the opportunity also, Wolfgang, when we're talking about how, for instance, different definitions play in, there's different definitions of multi-stakeholder that also get bandied about. And I thought it was kind of interesting in the June Council of the ITU, which is an organization which very often is considered to have ambitions in expanding its role in internet governance, that it portrayed itself quite strongly as a multi-stakeholder organization, which is probably a sensible move, politically speaking, because in the high-level panel report on the recommendation 4, which is global trust and security, the ITU is suggested as having a facilitator role, bringing together various processes, presumably meaning state and non-state processes. Presumably also, for instance, one of our processes like the GCSC. So for some, this is an interesting perspective, because the ITU sometimes seems to define multi-stakeholder a little bit differently than, for instance, the Internet Governance Community of the IGF would define it. So I mean, if this is all true, presuming it's true, what would prevent, for instance, the ITU from then basically making the public core an item of interest and then effectively advancing it in a direction that maybe some people in the internet governance community were previously a little bit worried that might occur? What's your opinion on that?
Alex, that's a very good question, which will keep us busy the next 5 years until this is plus 20 in the year 2025. But as Fiona has said, over the years, the whole field was characterized by different communities sitting in different silos. And what we see now is that these different cultures, these different silos are pulled together, and this creates a clash of different cultures and different traditions. So we have the trade people dealing now with digital tax and digital trade. We have the security people dealing with cyber issues, and we have the technical people sitting in the ITU and saying, all this is our business, and this is a conflict between ITU and ICANN since 20 years, since the ITU interim ad hoc or ITU dominated interim ad hoc committee did not succeed. ICANN was established. So you have this conflict. Who is responsible for the DNS? And the decision was made 20 years ago by the conference in Minneapolis in the United States in 1998. But now we see the ITU does not stop trying to capture some issues by just looking in the year 2030 and beyond by introducing crazy ideas about the need for a new internet protocol, which would to a certain degree substitute the TCP/IP protocol. So this is a field for permanent struggle, permanent clash of different cultures. But what is the difference to the discussion 10 years ago is that now the whole world has realized that we live in one world. So 10 to 15 years ago, there was still an understanding among heads of states. Yes, we are dealing with real-world issues on the state level, and for technical issues, we have our technical experts. But now, I think, in particular, with the experience of the pandemic, it became very clear that this differentiation doesn't exist anymore. The real world is, to a high degree, the digital world. And we live in the age of cyber interdependence. I think this was the headline of the title of the report of the high-level panel. So that means this includes that all parties, not only governments, but all stakeholders have to include whatever they do will affect others. Interdependence. I think this is really the catchword. And so the different cultures, the different interest groups are challenged to find new way of balancing their interests. So it's a big challenge to move towards, I would not say convergence, because there will be never harmonization on the global level, but we can find new balanced solutions which takes into account legitimate interest of other sides. So, but the public core is, everybody is dependent from this internet. And insofar, the public core is, let's say, above all these discussions. And this should be taken into consideration how you translate, let's say, this concept into a political norm, a legal norm, an ethical norm, a moral norm, or whatsoever. This is part of the discussion. And I think we have now a good new starting point for the next 5 years. And I'm looking forward with this plus 20 in 2025. And probably with the roadmap, we see indeed the start of a new beginning. So Fiona will agree, over the last 20 years, we moved from crossroads to crossroads, and crossroads always was the start of a new beginning. But this is now indeed the start of a new beginning after the pandemic, that the two different worlds are now united. Back to you, Alex.
Thanks. Thank you, Wolfgang. Cristine, a couple of points were just made here that I thought were particularly of interest to the technical community. First of all, this question of infrastructure or not, obviously that has implications for nationalization and then control. Also, the definition of multi-stakeholder, how does that include and regulate the participation of non-state actors and groups such as FIRST, where you are a member? And finally, how do we proceed from here? How do we actually also help combine this to basically help operationalize the protection of the public core? If we're going to track, for instance, violation of the public core or similar, how would this change depending on the definition of multi-stakeholder that we have? So just a couple of views from you, if you please. Thank you.
Hi, Alex. And I think it's very interesting, this whole discussion about what words mean. And it's not only on different cultures, but on different areas. You use a word and a lawyer will interpret something, and a policymaker will understand something else, and someone from the technical community will do something completely different. And in several countries, if you define something as a critical infrastructure, that immediately points that will be protected by the military, and that will be protected by something else, and that will become an utility, and that will be regulated. So that is the complete opposite of what we want from multi-stakeholders. So I think this is very complicated. In several cultures, we also don't have a difference between safety and security. Here in Brazil is one of the examples. It's the same word. So we cannot easily differentiate when we're talking about safety and security. That further complicates things. Several countries, when they hear security, they think, okay, let's create a police for the internet. And we know that internet security is much more keen to public health than to street security or police. So this is why I think the technical community pushed for several years to move for a cyber hygiene area. And I like that one of the norms was about hygiene, because we cannot have troops securing the internet. We can have ourselves protecting our devices and everything. So it's very complicated to navigate through these areas. And I would say that most technical community are still not really engaged on understanding like the more policy level language, because that is very complicated for the technical community. And sometimes we say very naive things that mean, and they are very loaded terms. So I think talking about this to move forward, places like the IGF are one of the interesting places where we can have people from different backgrounds and different mindsets to bring ideas together. Because, for example, I remember once that was very shocking. That was 2014, and someone in a session I was moderating just said, all certs are against human rights. And that was a point I said, okay, it's worse than I thought. So actually, not only people are not understanding, but they have preconception. So I think there is no real easy way going forward, but the technical community, I think it's more and more keen into understanding policy level, and we need to involve this community, because by the end, some of the proposals, they are impossible to implement. So I think this is one of the points. And other ones, I think, have the unintended consequences. And I think it's really the multi-stakeholder is the way to go, because we need to hear everyone and we need to balance the needs. And really, security on the internet, it's not security as security as a whole as people see. So that's my point.
Well, thank you very much, Cristine. We have only about 2 minutes left. I want to go to Uri, because you mentioned mindset. And one of the questions I think many people will have is, why was the Dutch government such an early proponent and backer of the public core norm? Can you share with us what your insight can deliver in terms of their thinking in the 30 seconds and minute we have left?
Let me say, it was already mentioned by Cristine, I suppose, that the Dutch government actually had a wake-up call already 10 years ago by now. It's unbelievable, but it's 10 years ago, with the so-called DigiNotar affair, where the certification corporation, which was under the full mandate of the Dutch government, was simply hacked. And we were in a crisis of 2 days, really a crisis on the edge of disaster. I was at that moment a cabinet minister, and I vividly remember it. So that was our wake-up call. But beneath that is, of course, the really basic point that Dutch government has always been very well aware of an internationally defined rules of the road. It's needed. It's both public good, and it is also in the well understood self-interest of a country which is open and which has to do free trade and what have you under a legal, international legal order. So that is actually the basis of it. And let me say that by now for the Dutch government, as far as I know it and follow it, for a small country like the Netherlands, it's of great importance to promote cyber diplomacy in indeed what we call in diplomatic terms the 1.5 track, which is not just states, but also involves NGOs and other actors involved. And this brings me, by the way, to the fact that, if I may say so, the Dutch government and Dutch society is a strong believer in a multi-stakeholder approach and indeed understands the need for a good balance between, for instance, institutionalized formats like, on the one hand, the International Governance Forum, and on the other hand, the UN. And let me say to those who are promoting the cause of the Internet Governance Forum, let me say that it is not just something that one of our few real world leaders, Angela Merkel, was promoting our cause in the context of an Internet Governance Forum meeting a few years ago. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Uri. We can clearly continue talking for a while, but even moving from virtual room to virtual room takes time, and we're already over time. So thank you very much for your participation. Thank you much for joining us today. And I hope you have a good RightsCon, and please feel free to engage with us on this topic going forward. Bye-bye.